The media has lied to you about dismissive avoidance. I don't often use attachment theory terms in my content, but today I need to. Because the way avoidant attachment style is being talked about online is misleading. And as a former dismissive avoidant, I need to clear this up. The more I hear and see online about DAs or dismissive avoidance, the more I feel misunderstood and unseen. Every time I come across attachment theory these days, people say avoidants are just afraid of intimacy or secretly craving love but push it away. And every time I think, no, that's not how I felt at all. What pop psychology describes is actually fearful avoidance. Its real label is disorganized attachment. And it drives me crazy that we even call it fearful avoidant because it just confuses everything. It's like mixing up East Coast swing and West Coast swing. Yes, they're both dances with the word swing in them, but they're completely different. If you've ever felt like attachment labels don't quite fit you, or you've been told you have fear of intimacy when that's not really how you feel, then stick with me. Because I'm going to explain why dismissive avoidants are completely misunderstood and why pop psychology keeps getting it wrong. Modern attachment discussions have taken dismissive avoidance and disorganized attachment and thrown them into one big avoidant category. But they're not the same thing. When people talk about avoidance, they almost always describe fearful avoidance. People who crave intimacy but sabotage it because of a fear of betrayal. They experience a push-pull dynamic, longing for closeness one moment and running from it the next. But that's not dismissive avoidant. DAs don't fear intimacy. We don't even really think about it. Emotional connection wasn't something we were raised to value, so we just don't engage with it. The fear of being hurt drives fearful avoidance to push and pull, craving closeness while simultaneously dreading it. But for dismissive avoidance, it's not about fear, it's about absence. The idea of deep emotional connection simply doesn't register as a need. And I wasn't the only one who operated this way. My sister-in-law once described my brother as Spock. If you're not familiar, Spock is a character from Star Trek, part of an alien race called Vulcans, who pride themselves on logic, control, and emotional detachment. To them, emotions are messy, irrational, and a distraction from what actually matters. They don't suppress emotions out of fear. They simply don't see them as useful. And I related to that. My family wasn't emotionally engaged, and no one questioned it. In our world, emotions were unnecessary, even irrelevant. We weren't taught to value them, process them, or engage with them, so we just didn't. That's the thing about dismissives. We don't sit around diagnosing each other's attachment styles. My family wouldn't have said, "Oh, that makes perfect sense," because to them, emotions weren't a topic worth discussing. We just didn't think about them. We were raised to focus on practicality, discipline, and independence, not emotional connection. That's why attachment theory, as it's described today, frustrates me. I wasn't secretly craving love and pushing it away. I was genuinely fine without it. When I discovered the original attachment research before pop psychology distorted it, it actually made sense. So where does dismissive avoidance actually come from? Not from trauma in the traditional sense of chaos, not from fear of rejection, but from something called childhood emotional neglect. Trauma with a little t. You can learn more about that from Jonice Webb's book, Running on Empty. This isn't some radical new idea. This is Attachment Theory 101. But somewhere along the way, online experts and influencers stopped referencing the actual research and started distorting the concepts. It's like they skipped the textbook and started rewriting attachment theory based on surface-level observations instead of actual science. I can no longer take for granted that attachment experts know the origin of attachment theory, so let's review real quick. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, made it clear. Attachment isn't just about fear of abandonment, it's about whether or not a child receives enough emotional engagement. When people think of attachment wounds, they usually picture chaotic households, severe neglect, or abuse. But what happens when the household is really structured and good and stable, but emotionally absent? That's where dismissive avoidance comes from. One of the best demonstrations of this is the still face experiment, conducted by Dr. Edward Tronick. In this study, a mother interacts with her baby, smiling, responding, and engaging. And then suddenly she goes completely still. No response, no emotion. The baby tries to reconnect, smiling, reaching, cooing, but when nothing works, the baby shuts down. This is the root of dismissive-avoidant attachment. Our parents weren't abusive or intentionally neglectful. They just weren't adequately emotionally present with us. When we did express emotions, they were often shamed, punished, or ignored. And because reciprocal emotional engagement was non-existent, we learned that emotional connection wasn't something that worked, so we stopped trying. Our nervous system adapted. We believed that emotions didn't matter, that love was real, but it's not something that you feel, it's something you see in actions. So why focus on emotional connection? And yet, dismissives still value companionship. We still care. We even talk about love, but we do it in tangible, logical terms. In our minds, love isn't about feelings or emotional presence. It's about what you do. It's about showing up, being dependable, supporting someone, and doing the right thing. Love is expressed through actions, not emotional depth or physical presence. When I look back, my experience wasn't unique. It actually describes so many people I knew. It's the classic 1950s household: good girl, good boy upbringing, Boy Scout, military, religious, or academic background. Everything looked fine. Success, discipline, and morality were emphasized. Emotional connection, not relevant. Emotions were seen as excessive, indulgent, or even unnecessary. Vulnerability wasn't nurtured, it was discouraged, shamed, or outright ignored. If we expressed emotions, the response was, get over it, be strong, or stop being dramatic. So we learned to do exactly that. It wasn't until I left those structured environments that I realized something was missing. The people I relate to weren't the ones who grew up in chaos or abuse. They were high achievers and high-functioning codependents who had been raised in emotionally absent but very good families. This is why I believe most discussions about avoidance are actually about fearful avoidance, not dismissives. Fearful avoidants have an internal conflict. They struggle with emotional turmoil, hot and cold behavior, and visible distress. They're running from something. Dismissives, especially those with childhood emotional neglect backgrounds, don't operate that way. There's no push-pull. There's no hidden longing. There is no inner conflict over wanting love but fearing it. Our emotional disconnection wasn't questioned growing up, it was normalized. Because we weren't taught how to engage emotionally, there was nothing to avoid in the first place. And that's why pop psychology gets dismissive avoidance completely wrong. They assume all avoidants are running from intimacy, but many of us never had a real concept of it to begin with. It wasn't fear. It wasn't trauma the way you think of it. It was emotional absence masquerading as normalcy. This is why so many high achievers and high-functioning codependents relate more to dismissive avoidance than to fearful avoidance. Our upbringing wasn't traumatic in the way that creates fear of intimacy. It was emotionally empty in a way that creates self-sufficient, detached individuals who don't even realize something is missing until later in life. For generations, kids were raised this way. Their focus was on performance over presence. It was about doing the right thing, working hard, being strong, and staying independent. Emotional depth? Irrelevant. Vulnerability? Unacceptable. Connection? A distraction. This is the real root of dismissive avoidance. Not fear of closeness, not trauma in the traditional sense, but emotional underdevelopment. The simple fact that emotional connection was never nurtured or valued in our upbringing. It was something we were conditioned to dismiss because the people raising us dismissed it too. If dismissives don't struggle with intimacy because of fear, then what's really going on? It's two things: disgust for vulnerability and fear of losing our autonomy. This is where people misunderstand dismissive avoidance completely. Because we were raised to believe that emotional expression was unnecessary, we didn't just avoid vulnerability, we rejected it. What dismissive avoidants actually avoid? Number one, vulnerability. Not because it's scary, but because we were taught to reject it. It was shamed in us, so we shame it in others. Number 2, depending on others. We were raised to believe that strong people don't rely on anyone. Needing others was seen as weak and pathetic. Number 3, being seen in our humanness. Vulnerability means exposing flaws, emotions, and imperfections, things we were taught to erase, control, or suppress. Number 4, emotional expectations. If emotionals come with demands for reciprocity, validation, or deep engagement, it starts to feel like control. For many dismissives, vulnerability didn't bring connection. It brought criticism, punishment, or rejection. We learned that stoicism and perfectionism were the only acceptable ways to exist, so we structured our lives around control and self-sufficiency. And here's the thing, because we never learned to feel compassion for ourselves, we don't have the ability to extend it to others. This is why avoidants come across as harsh, critical, or unforgiving. It's not that we don't care, it's that we don't understand how to process care in an emotional way. This reframes dismissive avoidance completely. Dismissive avoidants aren't afraid of love. We avoid it because it feels intrusive, unnecessary, and uncomfortable. It's not a fear of intimacy. It's a disgust reaction, a learned rejection of emotional connection because we were trained to see it as weak or shameful. Dismissives don't struggle with the push-pull dynamics like fearful avoidants. We simply don't engage because emotions were never reinforced as meaningful. We aren't avoiding love because we secretly want it but are scared of getting hurt. We avoid love because it was never a part of our framework for connection. So when people try to force emotional connection on us, it doesn't awaken some hidden desire for love. It feels like an intrusion, an expectation, or even repulsive. So if you've ever felt completely misunderstood by attachment theory, or if you've been told you fear love when you actually just don't think about it that much, this might be why. Dismissive avoidants are not the same as fearful avoidants. And frankly, we need to start calling fearful avoidants by the actual name, disorganized. Dismissives aren't running from love. They were never taught what emotional connection even is. And until attachment theory stops ignoring the difference between dismissive and fearful avoidance, so many people are going to keep feeling misunderstood. That's why labels matter. It's time to set the record straight. If you or any of your loved ones fit this description, I see you. It's not that you crave connection the way others do, but there's a sense of something missing. And maybe for the first time, you're starting to recognize it. The first step is acknowledging what's missing. And if you're ready to start exploring what change could look like for you, schedule a call with me. And for that avoidant part of you that thinks that's just too much, I get it. Even sending a message can be a step. If a call feels like too big of a leap, shoot me an email instead. I can attest, as a former dismissive avoidant myself, that change is possible.